Every photographer knows the famous names: Canon, Nikon, Leica, Zeiss, Sony. But photography history is also filled with brands that lived in the shadows, brands people bought when they could not afford the big names, only to discover that some of those lenses were far better than expected. Today we are talking about 3 of those brands, judged not by reputation, but by the lenses that proved they deserved respect. If that sounds like your kind of lens story, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses, because this channel exists for exactly this. There's a certain kind of brand that never gets invited to the glamorous conversation. No flagship boutiques, no heritage campaigns, no photographers writing love letters about the logo. Tokina was that brand. For most of its history, it lived in the shadow of Canon, Nikon, Sigma, and Tamron, treated as the practical choice, the affordable option, the lens you bought because you needed something solid without paying prestige prices. And yet, among photographers who actually picked up a Tokina and shot with it, something strange kept happening. They respected it, not in a polite, reluctant way, in a genuine, this lens does not quit kind of way. Tokina was never the most refined brand. It was not chasing elegance. What it was chasing was usefulness, serious optics, strong build quality, and focal lengths that real photographers actually needed. And when Tokina got a lens right, it did not just get it slightly right. It got it memorably right. The kind of right that gives a lens a nickname. At number 3, we have the Tokina ATX 90mm f2.5 macro, a lens so beloved that photographers stopped calling it by its proper name and started calling it the Bokina. Think about what that means. A nickname is not a marketing decision. It is not something a brand can manufacture. A nickname is what happens when a community of photographers uses a lens long enough, loves it deeply enough, and agrees without ever meeting that this piece of glass deserves something more personal than a model number. The Bokina was on paper a macro lens, and it did macro work beautifully. Close-up detail, fine texture, the kind of sharpness that makes small subjects look enormous in frame. But what made photographers remember? It was not the macro capability, it was the bokeh. The way this lens rendered out of focus areas had a softness and a creaminess that felt almost accidental, like Tokina had stumbled into portrait territory while building a macro tool, and the result was something genuinely lovely. Tokina was not supposed to be the romantic choice. It was not supposed to be the lens you reached for when you wanted atmosphere and feeling. But the Bokina became proof that even a third-party macro lens from a brand nobody was writing poetry about could earn a cult following through rendering alone. That is not a small achievement. That is a lens earning its place in history through pure optical personality. At number 2, within the Tokina lineup, we have the Tokina AEX 11-16mm f2.8 PRO DX. And to understand why this lens mattered, you need to remember what the photography world looked like before full-frame mirrorless became the standard conversation. There was an era, a serious, productive, creatively rich era, when APS-C DSLR cameras were what most photographers and emerging video creators actually used. Canon 700s and 500s, Nikon 5000s and 3000s. These were not beginner cameras in the hands of the people using them. They were working tools, and the problem those users kept running into was ultra-wide. If you wanted to go truly wide on an APS-C sensor, your options were either expensive, optically compromised, or both. Tokina answered that problem directly. 11-16mm at a constant f2.8, built for APS-C shooters who needed a cinematic ultra-wide without selling equipment to afford it. Before every creator was chasing full-frame mirrorless, before the sensor size conversation consumed every form thread, this lens helped APS-C shooters turn small DSLR bodies into serious visual tools. That is not a footnote in lens history. That is a lens that understood its moment. At number 1 within the Tokina section, we have the Tokina ATX 16-28 mm f2.8 PRO-FX. And this lens represents something important about what Tokina was willing to do when it decided to take on the full-frame market. This was not a small lens. It was not a light lens. It was not trying to win any awards for elegance or discretion. It was big, heavy, serious, and built in the way that Tokina built things, like it expected to be used hard and survive it. What it offered full-frame DSLR photographers was an ultra-wide f2.8 zoom at a price that made first-party alternatives look difficult to justify. Was it perfect? No. Were there sharper options at the extreme corners? Yes. But perfection was never the point. The point was that Tokina looked at what Canon and Nikon were charging for ultra-wide full-frame glass, decided that ordinary photographers deserved access to that focal range, and built something bold enough to compete. This was Tokina doing what it often did best, building a lens that did not care about looking elegant, as long as it delivered the shot. Tokina proved that an underrated brand could build serious lenses. But the next brand did something different. It did not just make alternatives to expensive glass, it made lenses that changed what ordinary photographers could afford to shoot. And it did it so quietly, so practically, that the photography world spent decades calling it the budget option while using its glass to make some of their best images. Tamron's reputation had a problem. The price was always visible before the quality was. You saw the number first, and the number made assumptions for you. Assumptions that the lens was a compromise, a placeholder, something you would replace once you could afford better. And those assumptions were wrong, because what Tamron was actually doing underneath the accessible pricing was solving real problems for real photographers in ways that brands with much bigger reputations were either ignoring or overcharging for. The key to understanding Tamron is this: its strength was never prestige. Its strength was usefulness. And usefulness, it turns out, is a form of respect that lasts longer than marketing. At number 3 within the Tamron lineup, we have the Tamron SP 90mm macro. And this lens has one of the most honest reputations in the third-party lens world, because it was never built on hype. It was built on decades of photographers picking it up, using it seriously, and coming back to it. There are 2 ways a lens becomes famous. One is through prestige, a famous brand, a famous price, a famous history that makes photographers want to own it before they have even used it. The other is through use, photographers recommending it to other photographers year after year because it keeps delivering. The Tamron 90mm macro belongs entirely to the second category. It became one of the most respected third-party macro lenses, not because of advertising, but because of flowers and insects and product shots and close-up portraits that looked better than they had any right to at that price. If one lens proves that Tamron was never just a budget brand, this is it. A lens family trusted by photographers who cared about detail, texture, and close-up beauty, and who found in Tamron something that expensive alternatives were not always willing to offer: honest, reliable, repeatable optical quality without the premium attached to a famous badge. At number 2 within the Tamron section, we have the Tamron 28-75mm f2.8. A lens that, for many mirrorless photographers, marked the moment Tamron stopped being a backup plan and became a genuine first choice. To understand why this lens landed the way it did, you need to understand what Sony full-frame mirrorless users were dealing with. The Sony ecosystem was growing fast, the cameras were exceptional, but the native lens prices were steep. And the Sony G Master zooms, as good as they were, came with price tags that made a lot of photographers pause. Tamron watched that gap, and then it filled it with a 28-75mm f2.8 that was smaller, lighter, and significantly more affordable without asking photographers to give up the image quality that made full-frame mirrorless worth shooting in the first place. This was the lens that told a generation of mirrorless shooters they did not always need first-party prices to get serious results. And that shift in thinking, that moment when photographers stopped treating Tamron as a compromise and started treating it as a legitimate choice, that is what this lens actually achieved. The optical performance was the proof. The attitude change was the legacy. At number 1, within the Tamron section, we have the Tamron SP150 to 600mm VC and USD. And this lens requires you to think not just about glass, but about access. Before lenses like this existed, 600mm of reach was a professional tool. It meant big primes, heavy bodies, serious money, and a level of investment that most photographers, even passionate, dedicated ones, could simply not justify. Wildlife photography at true telephoto reach felt like a category with a locked door. You either had the budget for the professional glass, or you shot what was close enough to see without it. Tamron opened that door, not with a lens that pretended to be something it was not, but with a lens that genuinely delivered reach. Stabilization through VC, autofocus performance through USD, and a zoom range that covered birds, aviation, wildlife, sports, and even the moon in a single barrel. For many photographers, this was the lens that made distant subjects feel possible for the first time. Tamron did not just build a long zoom, it made an entire genre of photography feel reachable. If you enjoy lens stories that go beyond the obvious names, the forgotten brands, the cult classics, the glass that photographers still argue about decades later, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. This channel is about the lenses that shaped photography, not just the ones with the biggest marketing budgets. Hit subscribe, and let's keep going, because the final brand on this list is the one that almost disappeared entirely. And its lenses still stop vintage collectors cold. Tamron is still here, still making lenses, still earning respect from photographers who care more about results than labels. But the final brand on this list is different. It did not survive into the modern era. It did not get a mirrorless chapter or a second act. It faded the way certain things fade when the industry moves on and the marketing stops and the shelves get cleared for newer names. Konica disappeared from the mainstream conversation so completely that most photographers under a certain age would not recognize the name without context. And yet, in the communities where vintage glass is traded, discussed, adapted, and used on modern mirrorless bodies, in those spaces, Hexanon is not a forgotten word. It is a respected one. People seek these lenses out. They pay real money for them. They mount them on Sony and Fujifilm bodies with adapters and shoot with them deliberately, choosing optical character over clinical precision. What Konica built through its Hexanon lens line was a range of glass that was compact, sharp, and full of a rendering quality that modern lenses, for all their technical superiority, do not always replicate. The company lost the marketing war. It lost the distribution war. It eventually lost the survival war. But its lenses did not lose their character. And character, as any vintage glass collector will tell you, is not something that becomes obsolete. At number 3 within the Konica lineup, we have the Konica Hexanon AR 40mm f1.8. And the first thing to understand about this lens is how unpretentious it is. It does not arrive with mythology attached. It does not demand a story before you pick it up. It is small, it is straightforward, and it sits in one of the most quietly useful focal lengths in photography. 40mm is not 50, it is not 35. It is the space between those two perspectives, slightly wider than a true normal lens, slightly tighter than a documentary wide. And for everyday photography, that difference matters more than it sounds. Street photos, family moments, travel, the kind of images that are not constructed but caught, the 40mm f1.8 is built for that kind of shooting. Light enough to carry without thinking about it, fast enough to work in the light you actually find. What the Hexanon 40mm adds to that usefulness is character. Modern lenses at similar focal lengths tend toward clinical precision. Every aberration corrected, every imperfection removed, every result technically flawless and visually identical. The Hexanon does not work that way. It renders with a warmth and a small amount of personality that modern glass has largely engineered out of existence. It is not the rarest Konica lens, but it may be one of the easiest to understand, small, simple, and full of exactly the kind of character that contemporary lenses often clean away. At number 2 within the Konica section, we have the Konica Hexanon AR 57mm f1.4. And this lens asks you to think about photography in a way that spec sheets cannot fully explain. There is a version of lens evaluation that is entirely rational: sharpness wide open, corner performance, distortion, chromatic aberration. These are real measurements and they matter. But there is another version of lens evaluation that photographers who shoot with vintage glass understand very well, and it has to do with feeling. With the quality of light a lens gathers, with the way a face looks in the frame, with the glow that surrounds a subject when the aperture opens up and the background dissolves into something soft and imprecise and beautiful. The 57mm f1.4 is a Konica lens that belongs to the second kind of evaluation. It is fast enough to create real subject separation. It is warm enough to give skin tones a quality that feels lived in rather than processed. And it has the kind of slight spherical character wide open that modern lens designers spend enormous effort eliminating, character that vintage shooters specifically seek out. This is the lens that reminds you why vintage glass survives. Not because it beats modern lenses on charts, because it gives the image a feeling that charts cannot measure. And if there is one lens that proves Konica deserved far more respect than history gave it, it is not the smallest one, and it is not the most common one. It is the portrait lens. It is the lens that shows what Hexanon glass could do when Konica stopped playing it safe and made something serious. At number 1, we have the Konica Hexanon AR 85mm f1.8. And this lens changes the conversation about Konica entirely, because Konica, for much of this video, has felt like a brand of compact, characterful, affordable glass, lenses you love for their personality and their approachability. The 85mm f1.8 is not that. It is a portrait lens built with real intent. It is sharp, it is controlled. It renders faces with a quality that puts it in direct conversation with the portrait glass of much more celebrated brands. What this lens does is prove that Konica was not limited to the charming and the compact. It was capable of serious optical engineering. The 85mm f1.8 is the kind of lens that, if it carried a Leica or Zeiss badge, would be discussed constantly in collector circles. It would be referenced in tutorials. It would have reviews with titles like The Forgotten Portrait Masterpiece. Instead, it carries a Konica badge, and so it is discovered quietly by photographers who were curious enough to look past the name and see what the glass actually did. This is where Konica stops feeling like a forgotten camera brand. This is where it starts feeling like a serious lens maker that never received the legacy it deserved. Canon, Nikon, Leica, Zeiss, Sony, they earned their reputations. Nobody is taking that away. But Tokina, Tamron, and Konica prove something that the history books rarely say loudly enough. Great glass does not always need the loudest name on the front. Sometimes respect comes quietly, through a nickname a community gave a macro lens, through a zoom that made wildlife photography feel possible, through a portrait lens on a brand that history forgot to celebrate. The lenses remember even when the marketing does not. If stories like these are why you come to YouTube, the forgotten brands, the overlooked glass, the lenses photographers still argue about, subscribe to alt buzz lenses. There is more where this came from.